Léonie Watson is an accessibility engineer and a director at the British Computer Association of the Blind. Léonie, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you.
You wrote a blog post called Losing Sight, which is riveting, and I'll put it in the show notes. Before we get to how you actually lost your sight, I'd like to hear some about your experience as a web developer in the late 90s .com boom.
It was a lot of fun. That's really the best way to describe it. Everything, felt very new. I'd been using the web pretty much since it began, since 93, 94, and came to it as a career a little bit later in the 90s. So to put this into context, when I first started building websites, we didn't have CSS at all. So, it was a much more simple world than it is now, certainly. But there was this great sense of, possibility. People were talking about things that now, I laugh to kind of think about it, but people were talking very seriously about, entire virtual online worlds, long before Second Life became a thing briefly and then disappeared again. And we had this amazing thing to play with, and that's kind of really what everybody was doing. How do we create new stuff? How far can we push this? And actually, that's the spirit of the web that I don't think has been lost along the way. I think that's still, one of the brilliant things about the web is just all these developers and engineers and designers out there going, you know what? How can we push this? How can we do more? How can we move things differently, shape them in different ways to come up with something new and exciting? And that's
how old were you around that time?
So I turned 20 in 1994. So I was my mid-20s.
Okay. And where did you work in the late 90s?
I worked for one of the first internet service providers in the UK, a company that was started up in 95 to provide internet services. And I started out actually on their tech support desk, and somebody in their wisdom decided that they needed to open the tech support desk 24 hours. And bear in mind, this was before most people were really using the internet, so the idea of anybody phoning up for tech support at 2:00 in the morning was, slightly optimistic. So I got dreadfully bored, so I just started teaching myself how to code websites, and fell in love with doing that and the whole creativity and having an online presence. And it kind of sort of blossomed from there, really.
Did it feel like a bubble around that time?
No, I don't think it did. It wasn't until, the crash came and we all kind of looked back and went, you know what, we were all running around like a bunch of kids having fun. We made some mistakes. I don't think it was really until then that we kind of realized, that it was a bubble. I guess, people who work on the stock markets and financial institutions probably took a very different view of it. The extraordinary amounts of money that were being thrown around in the early days of the web, probably sent up signals.
In retrospect, were there any signs, like cultural signs that indicated a bubble? Like, people talk about bubble, right now. I'm wondering if you see any parallels.
Parallels with now? No, not at all. I think because the .com crash of sort of early 2000 is still pretty firmly entrenched in too many people's minds for it to have been forgotten. So no, I don't really kind of liken it to the situation we're in now.
Interesting. Do you think there's an air of like over conservatism, whereas like even to some people it looks like a bubble, but maybe to others, I don't know if yourself is included in this, but if you see it as a more fundamental positive shift, maybe there's underinvestment. Do you think that's a possibility?
I think there was, probably up until a few years ago. So immediately after the crash in the early 2000s, certainly there was a very adverse reaction, both in terms of, it became very, very difficult to get funding of any kind. But also you saw it a lot in businesses. I was working for a startup, or I went to work for a startup in 2003, and they took great pains to present themselves very professionally in meetings. They would turn up in suits and looking very very typically businesslike, if you see what I mean, which was completely
the surest sign of fraud.
But it was this because in society there was a bit of a reaction. You guys on the web, you're all just running around playing silly so-and-sos. We can't take you seriously. You can't be trusted to run businesses. You screwed it all up. So there was this kind of sort of reaction where we almost had to become very serious, too serious, and convey this very business-like sort of appearance to sort of counteract that kind of somewhat mistrust, I think, in the industry at that time. But that was a go. We're the better part of 15 years away from that now, and I think now we're in a pretty good space, actually. I think there's a lot of confidence in digital technology and the web. But I think it's also tempered with, experience. And I think that puts us in a pretty good position.
Yeah, I agree. So against this backdrop of the dot-com boom in 1999, you lost your eyesight due to diabetes complications.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that morning in October 1999 when you woke up with a hangover and you noticed a ribbon of blood in your line of sight.
Well, that morning, in some respects, was quite unremarkable because I really just thought I'd bust a blood vessel in my eye because I'd been out drinking the night before. So in itself, that morning, as I say, wasn't anything remarkable at the time. But looking back, of course, it's now the point I realized that was the first physical sign that there was something wrong with my sight. And in due course, a couple of days later, I took myself to get my eyes checked out, and that led to more consultations, more medical investigations, which ultimately turned up the fact that I had this eye condition called diabetic retinopathy. So yeah, that was the start of the journey, I suppose.
What is diabetic retinopathy?
It's a condition that happens. It happens to a lot of diabetics who've been diabetic for a very long time. So especially people who are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes as a child. Type 1 means you have to inject insulin. You can't control it with diet or tablets. And you quite often find that people who are diagnosed as children, when they get to old age, experience difficulties with their eyes because of retinopathy. But it happens to people like me who don't take care of their diabetes well enough, so that accelerates the process. And when you don't control your diabetes properly, one of the side effects is that your blood gets so congested with excess sugar that it stops being able to send oxygen to important bits of your body. And one of the bits of your body that's most sensitive to that lack of oxygen is the retina, because it's fed by very, very tiny little blood vessels. And so they break down, and your body tries to compensate, create new blood vessels in an effort to get the oxygen needed to that part of your body. And because the blood vessels are created under emergency conditions, if you like, they're weak and they break. And that's what led to the busted blood vessel that I could see that morning in October that you just mentioned.
And once somebody is diagnosed with diabetic retinopathy, such as in your case, what are the acute measures that can be taken to try to fix things or reverse course?
You can't reverse course with type 1 diabetes. And it's quite important to understand the difference. There are two sorts. So the type you hear about on the news is known as type 2. And that's one that's often caused by people being overweight or, environmental conditions of one sort or another. And that can often be reversed, or if not reversed, pretty easily controlled through just a good, healthy, balanced diet and some tablet-based medication. But type 1 diabetes is where actually your pancreas, the organ in your body that produces the hormones that convert all the food you eat into usable energy. Your pancreas actually stops working, stops producing insulin, which is the hormone you need, and so you have to inject it yourself in order to sort of regulate your body's glucose levels. So type 1 isn't reversible, but it is completely manageable, unless you're an idiot like I was, and generally ignored all the wisdom of the doctors and didn't manage it. But there are millions of people around the world who manage diabetes, type 1 diabetes, perfectly well.
Well, there are also millions of people who make mistakes in their lives.
Oh, so. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm not alone. Sure.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, tell me more about, and you discussed this in great detail in your blog posts. Really, really interesting, and I really encourage listeners to check it out. But what was the transformation? Describe the transformation from the day where you wake up with that ribbon of blood in your line of sight and the day where you go to sleep with just a fragment of your sight left and you wake up completely blind.
Well, it took about a year, give or take a couple of weeks, which in terms of losing your sight over a period of time, as opposed to, through an abrupt accident or something, that's actually a very quick time period. So most people who lose their sight over a period of time, it happens over a number of years, possibly even decades. So to do it in sort of 12 months is actually quite a fast turnaround, if I can put it like that. And that, in some respects, was equally terrifying. But also it meant that I transitioned from sort of one thing to the next so quickly that I probably didn't have time to stop and think about quite how appalling it was, as much as I probably would have done had it taken longer. So that probably sounds really strange, but...
Well, it's like tearing the Band-Aid off.
Yeah, a little bit. Absolutely. Yes, it's a good analogy. So, you mentioned that I sort of, first saw that busted blood vessel in the October. So by kind of the February of the following year, it was quite apparent that I couldn't see straight anymore. Most stuff was pretty blurred. I couldn't work out details, on things. And I'd tried using magnification software on my computer to sort of boost up the size of text and bits and pieces. And then by the May, that had become a bit of an impossible task, and I stopped work. And as soon as I sort of got to the point where I'd stopped work, then it was my birthday in the summer, and that sort of, brought a new stage of, not being able to see a few more things. By that time I could see light and shadow, but not much else. And then by the sort of, the autumn, that was pretty much diminishing, through to the point in the December where, as you say, I'd sort of, remember being able to see the last kind of smudges of bright light sources, and then that too disappeared. So, everything sort of moved from one stage to the next so quickly that, I almost didn't have time to stop and really consider each stage as it happened, which was probably a good thing.
Yeah, and you talk in that blog post, you mentioned the moment when you realized that you would be blind forever, and you said, I cried for my lost sight, for all my broken dreams, for my stupidity, for all the books that I would never read, for the faces I would forget, and for all the things I would never accomplish. Mm-hmm. How did you move beyond that state emotionally?
That's a very good question, and there are probably different answers to it. In the first sense, I went to the doctor and said, actually, I can't cope. You need to help. And they put me on some antidepressants. And I mentioned this in the article. They basically put me to sleep. I'd wake up for 10 minutes in the morning to see my now husband off to work, and he'd come and prod me when he got home again in the evening, because I'd still be in bed and still be sound asleep. And that went on for several weeks before I decided that really wasn't any sensible way to carry on through life and stop taking them. But somewhere in that...
sounds like a depressant, not an antidepressant.
Yes, I'm not quite sure what it was. It was a showstopper, I think. But somewhere in that kind of 4-6 weeks of pretty much just being constantly asleep, I think it just gave my brain time to process some of what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So it was what you needed.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not the sort of person to kind of live like that long term.
It's interesting because that's not the type of antidepressant that I hear about these days. The types of antidepressants I hear about are more like I don't know, they have some stimulant nature to them, I think, a lot of times.
It's fortunately, and I count myself lucky to be able to say this, it's not a subject I know a great deal about. It's the only time in my life I've ever taken them. It may have been they were the wrong sort, or I have a unusual reaction to them, or I was, prescribed something that, maybe had that more sedative. I honestly don't know. And
sure.
And I've never really sort of stopped to ask, truth be told. But
and so beyond the tranquilizing antidepressant state, once you got off of those, what was your journey like?
Fraught, I think, is probably the short answer. It was difficult for a whole number of reasons. It's scary. That there's no getting away from that. If you ask most people who are sighted, how they'd feel about losing their sight, they'll tell you it scares them to death, and it did scare me. You have to learn how to do so much again. You sort of forget what it's like. We never really remember what it's like to learn stuff as a kid. We don't tend to remember how it was to learn to read, or to tie our shoelaces, when we got a bit older, to chop vegetables for dinner, or just all those kind of tiny little things. You sort of have to go back and learn how to do it again, and they're all completely achievable, but I'm not a patient person. In some respects that's a good thing, because it meant my friends tell me I have a good dose of what we call in England bloody-mindedness, just to kind of a determination to get on with life, and that served me well. But it also means that I'd get very frustrated, very cross with myself when I felt I couldn't learn how to do something again as quickly or as efficiently as I wanted to, and that was
you mentioned in the blog post like an incident where you're just like in the kitchen, you're just like trying to wash dishes, and you just end up like breaking a bunch of stuff. It's hard to read. It's tough.
It's one of those things you look back now and you can kind of laugh about it. But I just tripped, or I didn't even really trip. I just stumbled in the kitchen and put my hand out on the sideboard and caught the edge of the draining rack and literally just upended, I don't know how many plates and dishes and stuff all over the floor, and they literally just shattered like rain around me. And I could just remember standing in the kitchen and just reaching out for the phone on the wall and phoning up my mum and just come and help, because I think I had bare feet at the time, just to make things kind of more interesting.
Of course,
I'm just going to stay in the middle of the kitchen until you come and rescue me. And I say, you can laugh about it now, or I can, but you have to do that, because otherwise you'd cry a lot more than is entirely good for any of us. But there were pretty horrible days like that, and some worse.
Yeah. So okay, but you're a computer person, so like one of the things I'm really interested about is like, computers are not easy to operate, and all things considered. And how did you get from the point where you had trouble navigating the kitchen to the point where you can effectively have an influential computer job once again, even without sight? How describe that training process, that retraining?
It's slow. One of the first things that I discovered when I dug my computer back out of the cupboard was that I couldn't touch type, which seems ridiculous. It seemed ridiculous to me then. I've been using computers on and off since the 1980s, and yet I'd never bothered to learn how to touch type, because I could always see the keyboard.
Oh my!
And so I literally had to go back and I discovered this piece of or type of software called a screen reader that translates what's on screen into synthetic speech. And one of the things it does is when you hit a key, it echoes the key back to you. So you hit B, it says B. And so I went through this very painstaking process of just typing everything one character at a time, and listening to the screen reader to make sure I got it right, realizing I'd hit the wrong key because, I didn't have the muscle memory for touch typing. And, somewhere along the line, I got a bit quicker and a bit quicker and a bit quicker, and then suddenly, stopped thinking about it altogether. Like you do when you first learn to use a keyboard in the first place. It's unfamiliar at first, but at some point you look up and you realize you haven't actually thought about how to type in, however many weeks or months or days or whatever.
How does a screen reader work?
It basically sits on top of the operating system. So you get different screen readers for Windows, for Linux, for iOS, Android, OS X, and there are APIs on all operating system platforms, and those APIs make information available about what's on screen. So, you take an object like a button or a menu, and the accessibility APIs just expose characteristics about that thing. Whether it has a text label, how much screen space it takes up, a whole bunch of different characteristics, what it is, what it does, what state it's in. And screen readers just take that information and most commonly translate it into synthetic speech. So, if you see a button on a web page, my screen reader will say, hey, it's a button. And it has a text label in it, then the screen reader will just announce the text label and tell you that it's, a submit button or a search button. And that's pretty much how they work.
How does your workflow with a screen reader compare to your workflow as a programmer when you had Sight?
It probably hasn't changed all that much. I'm still pretty old school when it comes to coding. I just use a text editor, so I don't use any of the more useful kind of IDEs or anything like that. At some point, I think I probably decided that it was too much like hard work to try and overcome some of the accessibility challenges that those applications sort of presented. I just went back to using a text editor, and I've never really kind of dug myself out of that habit particularly. So in a lot of respects, it hasn't changed. Some things take longer, so it's harder to sort of debug code now. Because
why?
You can't do that sort of visual skimming thing. So, you kind of got an inkling of where a bug, the root cause of a bug is, and you can kind of sort of visually skim back through the code. It just takes a bit longer to read that code when you've got to listen to it.
Well, it kind of reminds me of, I used to hear these stories from, I have heard these stories from, old school programmers where you have to write all your stuff and then put it in punch cards, and then like you only get one chance to run it, you have to run it, and then like it's really hard to debug it because it's like you're running it on a mainframe or punch cards or whatever, and so the stakes are raised. So it caused them to be correct the first time a lot more, just because they knew there was so much pain associated with having to go back and debug it.
Yep. Yeah, there is something of that. I found, you need a good memory, or it really helps to have a good memory. Actually, it helps to have a good memory if you're blind anyway, because, you put something down, and unless you put it down in the place you expect to find it, you've got almost no chance of finding it again. So kind of, remembering what you did with stuff, and, remembering how you laid out your code, where something is, that really does make a difference, actually, having a good memory of how you wrote some code in the first place, or,
what kinds of applications are you coding these days?
Actually, these days I don't have much opportunity to put anything together in the complete sense. Most of what I do now is working with organizations to help them fix accessibility problems in their code. So I more often than not end up just either taking chunks of code and refactoring them so that they are accessible to people like me who use a screen reader, or people with other disabilities, or just looking at kind of common design patterns, and sharing those with good accessibility in, to try and help developers minimize the amount of work they need to do to make stuff accessible.
What is a common design pattern that is either inaccessible or a design pattern to refactor inaccessible code, inaccessible engineering to accessible engineering?
One of the things we come across at the moment actually feeds into a side project that I've been working on with some friends. We see a lot of tabbed interfaces and a lot of carousels, a lot of accordions, those kind of representations of content where there are multiple chunks of content, but only one is displayed at a time, and you want the ability to choose which one is displayed or cycle through each of them in turn. And they're quite complex interactions, but none of them really exist in HTML. So there are no elements for, a set of tabs or a carousel. So we create them using kind of divs and spans that in themselves, they're what we call semantically neutral elements. So they don't kind of make much information available to screen readers and other assistive technologies. So if you use a heading tag, an H1 through H6 in HTML, the browser knows that's a heading, and the browser will tell a screen reader that's a heading, and the screen reader will tell me. But if you use a div and a span, there's no real kind of useful information. It's just a kind of a holding element, if that makes sense. So we have to try and add in the accessibility manually, and we can do that with things like the ARIA specification. But we're all having to do this as developers ourselves, and every time a developer tries to do it, they do it a bit differently, or they have to start from scratch. And there are all these sort of complications that mean the whole process is kind of quite error prone. So all these complex widgets on the web tend to be a bit of a challenge for accessibility, both in terms of developing them and getting it right, and actually using them with a technology like a screen reader.
So are you saying that there are certain elements on a web page where the screen reader basically can't describe that element accurately to a blind person?
Div and span actually are pretty much it. So pretty much all other HTML elements, so images, paragraphs, tables, table headers, table rows, headings, pretty much every HTML element you can think of has what we call an implicit role, and the browser knows what the role of each element is. P holds a paragraph, heading is a heading, image holds a graphic, and because the browser understands what the role of each of those elements is, it can make that information available through the accessibility APIs I was talking about earlier, so that screen readers can pick up on that information and use it. But divs and spans are quite deliberately neutral. They don't have a particular role or a particular purpose of their own, which is why we use them to create custom widgets so much.
Could you talk a little more about how a web page is converted to an audible format with the accessibility APIs?
Yeah, sure. So when you load a page into the browser does quite a lot of work actually on your behalf, on the behalf of the developer and the user. So developers in your audience will know that when you load a page into the browser creates a document object model. So just a hierarchical tree of all the content on the page. But what the browser also does is take a whole bunch of that information from the DOM and creates an accessibility tree. So it's the same hierarchical representation of all kind of different bits and pieces on the page, but this time it just contains information that's useful to assistive technologies. And then the screen reader comes along, basically queries that accessibility tree to say, okay, what's the content? What have we got here? Do we have a bunch of plain text, or is there images in there, or are there links, are there headings, are there tables, all those kind of things. And with that information, it translates that into speech. So as I move through a web page, I get told when something's a heading or a table or an image or a link. If the image has an alt attribute with a text description, which is vital from my point of view, the screen reader will read that alt attribute contents to describe the image to me. So yeah, all that information is just exposed by the browser, picked up by the screen reader, and translated into speech that I can understand.
What are the types of organizations and companies that you work with to make their technology more accessible?
Oh, lots of different sorts of organizations, large and small. I work for a US company at the moment, so we're working with a lot of US universities, government departments, but also recognizable companies in the tech space. We've worked with Adobe and Google, and other companies who want to know more about making their products accessible, and we can provide that help.
Very interesting. So, I mean, when a developer loses sight, and I don't know how many you've encountered, is there typically like a barrier of discrimination or prejudice to reclaiming the job post disability?
It's not something I've ever experienced for myself, but I'm very well aware that it does happen, yes. And I don't think it's anything that's unique to engineering particularly. I think it's just a very typical thing of society in general. I've heard many people with all kinds of different disabilities, not just people who are blind, say, they've been more or less sort of dismissed from job interviews because, someone somewhere has basically said, you've got a disability, you can't possibly do the job. So yes, it is a very real thing. Whether that's, more prevalent in the technology industry, I honestly don't know. I do know a lot of extraordinarily good blind developers and technologists of one sort or another. So I know for sure we've got some really good ambassadors, really good leaders, kind of showing in a very practical sense, in a very real way, that it's absolutely not the case that someone with a disability can't do these jobs. But I suspect, we've got our fair share of discrimination here too.
How has the rise of smartphones affected what it's like to be blind and what it's like to be a blind technologist?
They've made an extraordinary difference, actually. I use mine, pretty much all the same things that everybody else does, social media, email, even occasionally a phone call. But what's amazing about smartphones and these other devices is that they've really lowered the barrier of getting assistive technologies. So, Apple have done an extraordinary thing, and all their devices now come with a screen reader built in for free. Now, you have to acknowledge that Apple devices are not the cheapest devices out there, but the fact that this technology is available as part of the thing that you buy, and they've taken great steps to make sure, as far as they can, that native apps and stuff for their devices are pretty accessible. Google followed suit. There's a free screen reader that's available for Android devices, and they too have put in a lot of work making sure that the software developer kits that you use for creating native apps have pretty good accessibility advice or quality baked in. So from a sort of development point of view, they've changed things a great deal. But also in terms of, I've got apps on my phone that will tell me what kind of paper money I've got. So here in the UK, money is it's all different sizes. So, £50 is a different size note to a £20 note. But of course, you guys in the States, all your money is exactly the same size. So, now I can just point my phone at, one of your dollar bills, and it'll tell me, which denomination note it is. I've got an app that tells me what color things are. I habitually wear black all the time, so this one isn't so much of a useful thing for me. But, there are times when it's quite nice just to know, what color something is that you're looking at. My phone will do that. I've got an app that will let me take a picture of something like, say, a menu in a restaurant, and it will convert that picture of text into plain text, and then the screen reader on my phone can just speak it to me. So, it's now possible for me to sit in a restaurant and take a picture of a menu and actually read it for myself. So it's opened up all these just amazing, activities that before were either expensive to accomplish, impossible to accomplish, or just too cumbersome to do, in the context. You've all got this now on your little device you can stick in your pocket and carry around with you. And for the most part, these apps just cost, a couple of quid. Some of them are more expensive, but the cost is considerably less than the old analog equivalent.
What about diabetes monitoring? Are there tools for the smartphone that have helped with that?
In general, yes. The real irony in all of the above is that I have yet to find a really accessible diabetes monitoring app for blind people. Which it never fails to amaze me, actually. It's just staggering. You think, because I think I don't know about globally, but certainly in a lot of developed countries, diabetic retinopathy is usually one of the top 3 causes of blindness. And you kind of think, we live in a society where you've got this primary condition that all too often causes a secondary condition, and yet the tools for managing it are still almost
rarely
by
cover the
standard
intersection.
inaccessible. Yeah, absolutely. So I like all diabetics, I prick my finger to test blood glucose levels, and I have a talking device that I can do that with. But that device is also capable of being plugged into my computer, so I can do interesting things with the test results on my computer. Just look for, analysis and patterns and all the rest of it. But that software isn't accessible. So somebody somewhere, they created these talking blood glucose monitoring devices, which are designed for blind people, but then sort of forgotten about the next bit, which is it's ludicrous. It really is.
Why isn't there some kind of dongle that you can plug into your phone that, you prick your finger and the dongle communicates with the phone, and then you have the diabetes monitoring stuff just all in your phone?
I suspect actually that there probably are projects where people are working on that thing. And I know in the US, you have a lot more technologies available to diabetics than we do here in the UK. I don't know if it's because our sort of medical review processes over here are, more stringent. I doubt it, but it may be budgetary. I don't know. But we also use different mechanisms for measuring blood glucose levels in the US and the UK, so I can't even come over to the States and buy some technology and take it home with me. But yeah, I think it will improve. I know from reading a thread on Hacker News recently, after someone posted my article there, that there are actually some open source projects where people are working on apps and thinking about these things. So, I'm hopeful that somebody will figure it out soon, and hopefully with more power to them make an awful lot of money for themselves and show the rest of the world that it's a good thing to do for, business reasons as well as ethical reasons.
To get a better picture of the narrative arc of your story, how did you end up working on accessibility software? It's certainly an understandable route to have taken after that, but I'm just curious, what was the series of events that led to you working on accessibility software?
It actually happened by accident, which always surprises people, because the logical conclusion is because I lost my sight, I developed an interest in making things more accessible, and then went to work to do something about it. But it wasn't that organized, I'm afraid. Somewhere not long after I started to use my computer again, I had joined an email list for people who use the screen reader that I do most often. And one day somebody posted an email. This would have been very early 2002, I think. And this person, whose name was Alistair, said he worked for a new company, and they just built their first website, and the client didn't have budget to test the website with people with different disabilities. But when they built the website, they tried very hard to follow accessibility guidelines from the W3C, and they'd welcome any feedback from screen reader users to to tell them how they had done and whether there were things they could do to improve it. And so I thought, well, I used to be a web developer. I'm definitely now a screen reader user, so perhaps I can help. So I went and had a look at this website, and I sent an email to Alistair with some feedback, and we got talking, and it turned out that the company he worked for was just about 25, 30 miles away from where I lived at the time. So I started just doing occasional bits of work for them, reviewing websites and, writing reports for them, and eventually became, a full-time employee of theirs as the startup kind of, found its feet. That was sort of 2003. I think I was employee number 6, I think, in the company. When I left a couple of years ago, they were well on their way to heading past 60 people, and a really good business turnover. So I'd stayed with them, for 11 odd years, seeing them through kind of lots of transitions. And it just so happened that, accessibility was a big part of what that company was about, that and usability. So yes, it was really just a chance encounter, response to an email that led to it, and nothing more than that, really.
Interesting. And then since then, you've just been doing kind of consultative work, or? Yes,
pretty much. I mean, the company I was just mentioning, consultancy was a large part of their business. So to some extent, that's been a focus of mine, all through that sort of period up until the current day. But now the company I work with, the Paciello Group, their focus is a lot more on the kind of engineering side and development and code. So probably for the first time actually in quite a long time, I'm able to actually really get back into the detail of how things are built and how they work and how they can be made to work better, which is nice. I'm enjoying it.
So speaking of that, I mean, if there's a listener out there right now who's building something, a web developer, what are there libraries or tools or best practices that developer can use to improve accessibility?
Yes, there are. So if you're thinking about sort of widget component libraries, jQuery UI has some pretty good accessibility baked into it. You need to keep a little bit of caution when it comes to the JavaScript frameworks like Angular, Ember, and React. They tend to have pretty poor accessibility by default, but there's a growing community of people working on improving that, and there are some good tools available. In fact, for all 3 of those frameworks I just mentioned, there are NPM packages for accessibility testing tools that you can factor into your build environment, which will help kind of run some checks and point you in the right direction of things that might need fixing. There are guidelines called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from the W3C, and they provide sort of fairly broad brush guidance on things you need to think about. So making sure people can use your website without a mouse. So people like myself, obviously, we just use a keyboard. We don't use a mouse. Making sure that people can read and see content in the things you're building. Like a lot of accessibility, actually, most of this advice is just really good advice for making things usable by everybody.
Yeah.
Making kind of text comfortable to read is just common sense. If you've got something important on your website, and presumably you think it's important because you've put it on the web, there's no point in making it kind of too difficult for people to read. So yeah, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, have lots of advice and techniques on a whole bunch of different things you can do. That's very web focused rather than sort of mobile or native app, but it's a good place to start. Beyond that, there are countless blogs and places to go for information. The W3C has an email list called WAI-IG, which is open to everybody. It's got about 800 or 900 people who are very interested in accessibility there, where you can ask questions. There is a Gitter and Slack channel called A11y Slackers, which is also plugs into IRC, which has got another couple of hundred very technically minded accessibility people hanging out there. So, it's a great place for developers to come and hang out, ask questions, share information. I spend a lot of time, talking and chatting there with lots of people. Blogs like WebAIM has a lot of great accessibility information. The company I work for, TPG, the Paciello Group, we post regularly on a blog. Just looking around on Twitter, the web, there's plenty of stuff out there because there are a lot of people thinking about this, which is really good.
Do you keep track of the types of innovations that people are kind of working on to fix this type of to fix your type of condition, like to fix diabetic retinopathy? I don't know whether that's some sort of like brain to computer interface or stem cell for eyes. Do you track this stuff?
I do a bit, yes. And there is some really interesting work going on in sort of two different areas. You mentioned stem cell research. That's definitely one area of research that has possibilities, in terms of being able to in my case, regrow my retinas, which have long since disappeared. But also, perhaps in time actually being able to, replenish or grow or whatever the word might be, entire eyeballs for people who've actually lost those perhaps through an accident or something. At the moment, I think I'm rather more hopeful of the technology side of things, but then perhaps I would say that. So there's a lot of research being done into technologies that will let you wear a camera on a pair of glasses, and they will then transmit signals to a chip that would be implanted in your brain, probably somewhere around about the optic nerve or the back of your eye, and that would very simply sort of, send light signals that you'd be able to perceive. And there've been some, trials with this where they've managed to do this quite successfully in a very, very crude and basic way. So we're just talking, tens of the equivalent of sort of, tens of pixels wide by high. So, really not much more than being able to see, a tic-tac-toe kind of board. But it's a start.
But people are willing to have chips implanted in their brain to try that?
Yep. There've already been some pretty successful trials, and the resolution, even just in the few years that I've been sort of keeping an eye on this, the resolution of what's possible in that regard seems to have improved. There are still a lot of challenges and a long way to go, but yeah, there's really sort of positive research being done in that area.
How well is the interface between like the brain and computers understood?
That I'm not sure I can answer. Given that we seem to understand relatively little about the brain altogether, my hunch is probably not as much as we really ought to know before we start screwing around with some of this stuff. But you know what? If we humans ever stop to think about what we were doing, a lot of the time we probably wouldn't make half the progress that we do. So, I don't know. I think there's some amazing possibilities. I mean, I know there's research being done into the ability to control technology just using your mind. Again, some really, significant steps have been made there, which is, extraordinary for people with physical disabilities. To be able to think about doing something. And, we start to see this now in a lot of sort of prosthetic limb development where, they're actually able to sort of tap into the nerves and muscles. And so you can actually, control a prosthetic hand, for example, in roughly the same way that you would control an actual hand by, just thinking that you want to move and pick something up or make some gesture. So, we're doing a lot of research in a lot of, kind of medical fields with that, and probably, gaming actually. Gaming is the place you want to look, actually, because if anything's, if anything's new and interesting, actually, the gaming industry is quite likely to have tried it first, and more often than not, actually, we can look to a lot of medical solutions from those kind of industries.
I have heard some interesting things about, how like what is at the cross section of research and gaming. What do you see there?
I think there's some interesting things. So I read about some research that Disney was doing about a year ago into I forget what they called it, but it was basically using air to provide tactile feedback for gaming. So to give you the impression that a tennis ball had just whistled past your ear because you missed the shot, just using sharp puffs of air and other sort of strengths and blasts of air, if you like. And that's got some quite interesting possibilities from an accessibility point of view. If you can kind of create the impression of physicality, that's enough to convince someone, as I say, a sort of ball's just gone whistling past their ear. Imagine what you could do to try and help people who can't see an environment understand what's around them, for example. Creating new interfaces or new ways of getting responses out of our systems. So, at the moment, you maybe hit a button on a website and it might cause a sound effect, but that's no good if you can't hear the sound effect. Or, the button might look like it's been pressed, but that's no good if you can't see that it's been pressed. So, using these kind of different interaction modes, be it, high pressure air or vibration, tactile feedback of one source or another, all these things, they've got their kind of origins in the gaming industry, but they have interesting possibilities for the ways people interact with kind of the web and technology on a day-to-day basis, I think.
It's fascinating. So I guess I'd like to begin to close off. Do you have any recommendations for like reading material for our listeners, like to either to the things that have helped with your journey since contracting diabetic retinopathy, or just things that help with empathy for accessibility, people who need accessibility, so any kinds of resources that you think would be useful?
Resources are difficult to suggest, partly because I suppose I never really had to look for resources on how to sort of empathize, because it was me that was going through the whole thing. I suppose if I could offer one piece of advice, it would be try not to sweat it too much. I meet a lot of people and we'll be talking and they'll suddenly say, did you go and see Martian at the movies? And then, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say, did you see? You know what? It's kind of okay. Yes, I did go and see that movie. No, I didn't see it, but I watched it. I still say, I read that book. You know what I mean? And people get very worried about accidentally offending or upsetting someone who has a disability, and sure, you get some grumpy people with disabilities that'll get offended no matter what you say, but you get grumpy people that get offended anyway. That's right. That's nothing to do with the disability, but most of us, if you mean the right thing, we're smart enough to know you meant the right thing. We're not going to get tangled up on language and things like that. So the best thing you can do is just get on with it. Just talk to people. Use the language you would normally use. Are
there any other projects that you're working on currently that you haven't mentioned?
Well, I do a lot of work with the W3C, so I work a lot on things like the HTML specification, ARIA, and other bits and pieces. So that takes up a lot of my time. I've just become one of 4 co-chairs responsible for the web platform working group that's responsible for specs like HTML and and document object model and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I don't know if you can call that a side project, but it's certainly something that's taking up a lot of time. I'm pretty interested in SVG and accessibility at the moment. Working with some friends on what we can do to make SVG more accessible to different people. And
what kinds of things are you thinking about there?
Well, at the moment, SVG itself doesn't have a lot of accessibility. So like I was saying that, the browser knows what most HTML elements do in an accessibility sense. We don't really have that in SVG at the moment. It's coming in SVG 2. But right now, if you put some SVG, into a browser, the browser doesn't really make any accessibility information available. So screen readers kind of just look at it and go, nah, no. So we're looking at getting SVG2 more accessible natively. But what I'm looking at the moment with a friend is how we can use technologies like ARIA to add some of that accessibility information into SVG in the same way we've used ARIA to do the same for HTML for a while now. And it's proving an interesting exercise because, so many variables. There's SVG itself, different browsers, different screen readers, different techniques for adding in the accessibility. So yeah, it's proving a head scratching but satisfyingly head scratching project at the moment.
Fascinating. Well, Léonie Watson, thanks for coming out to Software Engineering Daily. It's been really interesting talking to you.
You're very welcome. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for asking me.